Hi guys, and welcome to this week's video. This time it's another cheap art supply challenge, today with water-based markers, also known as felt tip pens. I've already completed two cheap art supply challenges before this one with coloured pencils and the other with acrylic paints, so if you haven't seen those I'll leave a link in the description box and in the cards. So yes, today I'll be using this 18 pack of felt tip pens, which I purchased for 33 Norwegian kroner, or roughly £3 or euros, and about $4 US. Like the coloured pencils and paints I used in my previous videos, I bought these from the shop Søstrene Grene, and of course I'm not sponsored, I just really like their selection and how affordable their stuff is. So I'll start swatching these pens and talk a bit more about the product and the challenge before getting on with the task of trying to create something with these. So my goal for today's cheap art supply challenge is to make something that I'm relatively proud of with supplies that are readily available to most people and that can be found inexpensively. The arbitrary rule that I've set myself is to not go over a budget of the equivalent of about $10 US, but I'm certain that you can find similar items at a lower cost depending on where you live, as items here in Norway are quite expensive compared to other parts of the world. I was drawn to these pens when I saw them because I noticed that they had what looked to be a brush nib to them, but I quickly realised when testing these pens that the nib is very hard and not flexible at all. You can get variety in line weight by changing the angle of the pen, but nothing groundbreaking, and I imagine that you can get similar results with a regular old bullet nib. I really wasn't impressed by the pen's feel on the paper. Some felt quite dry and they had a scratchy feel to them. The colour range looked to be promising, but upon application many of the colours were practically identical. One positive was that these pens dissolved very readily in water and the colours didn't appear to separate. I tried a few different techniques to see what sorts of textures I could achieve at the side of the page too, and I was interested to see how well salt would react with the inks when they were wet with water. The ink soaked into the paper very quickly, so the salt didn't have too much time to react, but the technique does work. So I swatched these colours out on a sheet of very cheap watercolour paper. The whole pad here cost me a couple of dollars and there were 20 sheets in the pad, but I haven't calculated this into the cost of the challenge. This is because I could have swatched these on essentially anything just to check out the colour, or I could have swatched them on the paper that I use later. Speaking of which, I've decided to use higher quality paper for the drawing that I complete. Even if you're on a tight budget, I really recommend not skimping out on paper. You can do much more with cheap pens on good quality paper than good pens on poor quality paper. But I've chosen to complete this piece in my sketchbook as it's been a while since I've worked in it, but admittedly if I included the cost of the sketchbook then I would have likely gone over my budget of $10 because I bought the sketchbook locally and it was relatively expensive. However, I have found the same Canson mixed media sketchbook on the US Amazon for $7, so if you're looking to replicate this challenge in the US it would be entirely possible to complete it under the $10 mark. There are alternative papers that you can find that are good value for money. The Canson XL range, for example, is something that I can recommend if you don't have too much money to spend. Some shops also sell loose sheets of open stock paper and give out sample sheets of paper too, so if you're tight for cash I recommend trying out a few things before committing to a large pad of something. Paper in large thick pads work out to be cheaper than individual sheets or smaller pads. I recommend cutting up your paper and working smaller as well if you're looking to use less of your materials and spare a few pennies. So aside from the pens and my sketchbook, the other materials I'll be using are a jar of water, which we'll call practically free, the glass tile underneath my work, and I'll be using this as a mixing surface, but any non-porous surface would do, a pencil, eraser and sharpener, and I'm not going to put a price on these things because I would imagine most people have them laying about somewhere. And the final item is a paintbrush. I bought this as a part of a larger set a while back, but I just used what I had handy. None of my paintbrushes are particularly expensive and I'm sure that you could find something similar to this for maybe $1. Starting out with the drawing, I used my graphite pencil to quickly sketch out the basic shapes that I see in my reference photo. I didn't record the majority of the sketching process as I was having a hard time capturing the sketch on camera because I was using the pencil so lightly, and I erased away the majority of the darkest lines as I wanted to avoid muddying up the ink that I used to colour this piece. So about making art with affordable supplies, I recognise that I come from a place of privilege. Although items and shipping is much more expensive here in Norway than they are perhaps in America or other places in Europe, living wage here in Norway is rather high, and thus comparatively, art supplies in general are fairly affordable. Items are also actually obtainable, so even if I may have to wait a while for an item to be shipped, at least there are shipping options available for me. And I realise that in other countries across the globe, shipping options might not even be available, or if they are hugely expensive. Australia and New Zealand in particular spring to mind. Shipping costs have such an influence on the cost of an item that it can then become difficult to judge if an item is even worth the cost. Another issue is that living wage might be comparatively lower in some countries, meaning that international brands are much less affordable for those people. I've seen artists in this predicament, especially when it comes to making art they want to sell. They prefer it to be lightfast and archival art supplies come with quite the hefty price tag and often have to be shipped internationally. So if you're in this scenario, I recommend trying to get hold of graphite pencils. Relatively speaking, graphite is low cost and extremely lightfast. They're also fairly available. Even if you can't get hold of an artist set, stationery shops often sell a few different hardnesses as school and office supplies. So you could start off by offering monochrome graphite artwork and commissions, and as you get sales you can begin to save up towards light-fast colouring supplies. Anyway, back to how I worked on this piece. I tried working in layers of each main colour to begin with to avoid the colours blending into each other. I applied the pen to the paper in the darkest and most saturated areas first, and used a damp brush to spread out the colour. I repeated this process for a few other colours until the main bulk of the chameleon was mapped out. I did have to rework the green and blue areas after I'd added the red though. The red was very dominating and made the initial colours look quite washed out. I then applied some texture and detail. I used the pens to apply dots for texture in some places to give a feel for the chameleon's scaly skin. And overall, I tried to work from loose to more detailed as I completed this piece. The pens are very soluble, so it doesn't take much to destroy fine lines and edges if you work over the top of the detailed areas. So it was wise to leave the finer details for last. If you're interested in techniques to try out with water-based markers, I'll leave a link to 2 of my review videos I've made before on brush-tipped pens. I go through a few different blending techniques in more detail in those videos. Another piece of advice I want to quickly cover about making art on a budget is to shop around. You can find good supplies that are inexpensive without limiting yourself to kids' supplies. For example, buying just a couple of good quality pencils open stock or a small set is better than buying a larger set of poor quality pencils in my opinion. Blending opportunities are far better with higher quality pencils, so even with a smaller set you can still achieve a fantastic range of colour. Looking online is another good option if you're happy to wait for shipping, and of course if the shipping isn't extortionate. Check out second-hand opportunities as well. eBay for instance was a great source of art supplies for me a few years back. I bought a massive amount of Trier alcohol-based markers there for between a quarter and a third of their recommended retail price, because perhaps they'd been opened and used just once. Art supplies are often the type of thing that are resold barely used, as a lot of people decide they want to pick up art as a hobby but quickly realise they don't have the time or perhaps patience for it. Use a discerning eye and expect to spend a good amount of time looking for your bargain, but in my opinion it's well worth it. This piece is certainly not my best piece. There are always limitations when working with a cheap, low quality material. However, I was still able to create and practice, which is the most important thing. You do not need expensive supplies to have fun and learn. Moreover, I think kids' water-soluble markers make a great alternative to low-quality watercolours, as the pens are incredibly soluble in water, very bright and pigmented, and don't have a chalky finish like many cheap watercolours do. Of course, I can't expect that this piece would hold up well to light. The pens are not light fast. So although these cheap materials are fine for practicing with, I can't display or sell a piece made with these pens. But this isn't a concern if your main goal is to improve and experiment, things that are much more important than trying to commercialise your work. And if you are able to master the cheap, low quality supplies, you'll likely have no problem with supplies that are designed for art. You really do have to fight the medium more with low quality supplies in order to get the desired outcome, and when you upgrade to a better quality supply, you'll really appreciate the difference. For example, cheaper supplies tend to have a lot of binder and not a lot of pigment, so to get a very rich colour you might have to apply many more layers than you would with an artist grade equivalent. Additionally, I did have to adjust the way I work in order to make these pens do what I want with them, and the outcome isn't the realistic type of work I can create with coloured pencils. I probably could have made something more realistic if I had spent a lot more time on this piece though, but no doubt it would have been more challenging and time intensive than the higher quality products I've grown used to using. So here's the finished piece. I'm so glad I've started this sketchbook off with such a fun and colourful drawing. I'm not sure if I entirely filled my criteria for this challenge, but certainly the essence of the challenge was there. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave it a like. Feel free to ask questions in the comment section, I always answer them as soon as I can. If you'd like to share your art, chat and make arty friends, ask questions and ask for critiques, consider joining my Discord chat server, link to that is also in the description box. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on my next arty video. Thank you very much for watching, have a lovely week, and I'll see you in the next video.